Raw gold looks almost nothing like the gold people picture in their heads, and that single gap causes most of the disappointment out there. The metal that nature hands you is usually tiny, often dull, and very easy to wash straight out of a pan without ever noticing it. There is also a step that almost everyone skips, which is finding out whether their own region has ever produced any gold at all. That step is free, and it takes about 20 minutes at a computer, and it can save you entire summers of wasted weekends out there. So this is the practical side of gold, with the real signs to look for in the ground and the real tests that separate gold from the fakes. I'm not going to promise you a fortune, since the honest truth is that most gold found by hobby prospectors would fit on a fingernail. Gold is worth more today than almost ever before, though, so even those small amounts are worth keeping and worth learning to recognize. What you can realistically expect is to know whether your ground has potential and to recognize the metal when it finally shows up. That is a real skill, and it costs almost nothing, since the tools involved are cheap and most of them are already in your house. Everything here applies to ordinary public creeks and hillsides across this country, in places most people drive past without a thought. Finding out if your region has gold. The first question is simple, and it is whether gold has ever been found anywhere near the place where you actually live. Gold is not spread evenly across this country, and most of it sits in a handful of belts where the right geology happens to exist. If you live outside those belts, no amount of patience or equipment will change the result, and that is worth knowing before you buy anything. The main gold country in this country runs down the western states, through the Rockies, and along parts of the southern Appalachians. Alaska holds a great deal of it as well, and there are smaller districts scattered through the Midwest and the Southeast. The fastest way to check is a free government database called the Mineral Resources Data System, run by the United States Geological Survey. It holds records for well over 300,000 mineral sites, and anyone can search it from a phone or a laptop for nothing. You pick your state, you filter the commodity for gold, and it returns every recorded mine and prospect and occurrence in that state. Each record tells you the location, whether the site was placer or hard rock, and whether it actually produced or was only a hopeful prospect. That placer and hard rock label matters to you, since placer means loose gold in gravel, which is the only kind you can work with a pan. Hard rock records still help though, because a vein up on a hillside feeds every creek that drains it for miles downstream. So look for clusters, since one lonely dot on the map means far less than a dozen dots crowded into the same set of drainages. You can export the whole list and open it in a mapping program which drops a marker on every historic gold site around your town. One honest warning about those coordinates, since many were typed in from old paper reports and some of them are off by up to a mile. So treat each marker as a neighborhood rather than an address, and verify it on the ground before you build a plan around a dot on a screen. The second source is your own state geological survey, since almost every state with gold has published free reports on its districts. Those reports name the creeks, describe the host rocks, and often explain exactly why the gold ended up sitting where it sits. The third clue is history, because a gold rush leaves names behind on the map long after the miners themselves are gone. Creeks and gulches named around gold, or named after an old mining camp, usually carry those names for a very good reason. Old topographic maps are worth studying too, since the small crossed pick and shovel symbol marks workings that modern maps no longer show. You can pull those old maps for free from the government map viewer, and comparing an old sheet against a new one shows what got erased. Now for the geology. Most hard rock gold in this country sits in quartz veins that filled fractures in older rock, usually along ancient fault zones. So mountain country with a long history of faulting and folding is the classic setting, and flat young sediment is usually the opposite. Another strong setting is dark green metamorphic rock, which prospectors simply call greenstone, cut through by pale quartz veins. Contacts matter as well, meaning the boundary where a body of granite pushed up into older rock and cooked the ground all around it. Those contact zones are where hot fluids concentrated, and a great many gold districts in this country sit right along a boundary like that. You can see all of this on a free state geologic map, where each rock unit is colored and the faults are drawn as heavy lines. Learning to spot a fault line crossing a creek on one of those maps is one of the most useful skills in this entire hobby. The northern states have a different story, since glaciers scraped gold off distant bedrock and dropped it into the soil as they melted. That glacial gold is scattered thinly across enormous areas, and it never leads back to a vein, since its source may be hundreds of miles away. So in glaciated country, you can find real gold, and yet following it upstream will teach you nothing about where it originally came from. Once you know the region has produced gold, the next job is reading the ground itself, and a few signs are genuinely worth trusting. The first sign is quartz, since most hard rock gold in this country came out of white quartz veins cutting through darker rock. A white vein slicing across a hillside always deserves a look, though most quartz on this planet carries no gold whatsoever. What raises the odds is quartz that looks damaged, stained rusty orange and brown, and cracked and crumbling apart in place. That rust comes from iron minerals that rotted away near the surface, and those same minerals very often traveled with the gold. Prospectors call that rusty stained cap a gossan, and it is one of the most reliable surface signs in this entire hobby. A gossan can show up in reds and browns and even purples, and it stands out sharply against pale ground in dry, open country. Sometimes the rotted minerals leave small cubic holes behind in the rock, and that little honeycomb texture is worth stopping for. The second sign is old workings, since the miners of the 1800s walked and tested nearly every creek in this country. If you find old pits or hand-stacked rock piles or collapsed shafts, then somebody already proved that gold was in that ground. Please stay out of any shaft or tunnel because old timbers rot and the air inside goes bad. The waste piles outside are safe enough though, and the old equipment was inefficient, so those piles often still hold gold today. Old miners routinely lost the finest gold since the equipment of that era simply could not hold onto particles that light. The third sign shows up in the creek itself, and it is black sand, which is simply the heavy iron-rich grit left behind in your pan. Black sand settles exactly where gold settles, so it tells you the water is sorting material in the way that you need it to. Black sand by itself proves nothing at all about gold, and yet gold with no black sand anywhere around it is uncommon in most creeks. The fourth thing to read is the water, since gold is roughly 19 times heavier than water, and it stops moving when the current relaxes. That means the inside of the river bends, the quiet pockets behind big boulders, and the cracks in any exposed bedrock nearby. Bedrock cracks are the best of all, since gold sinks until something hard finally stops it, and bedrock is where that sinking ends. Dig down to the bottom of the gravel wherever you can, because the richest layer usually sits right against that solid floor. Always sample the upstream side of any obstacle that has been sitting in the water for years, since that is where the current first slows. Search after a hard rain as well, because fresh material washes in, and the ground gets rearranged in ways that expose new gravel. Now for the metal itself, because plenty of people walk right past real gold, or throw it away without ever knowing what they had. Natural gold is almost never pure, and most of it runs somewhere between 70 and 95% gold by weight. The rest of it is usually silver, and the more silver a piece happens to carry, the paler and more lemony the color of it becomes. The first test costs nothing at all, since you simply move your hand into the shade and watch what the yellow thing does. Pyrite needs direct light and goes dull gray the moment the sun leaves it, while real gold keeps glowing warmly in the shadow. The second test is touch, since gold is soft and malleable, meaning it dents and bends under gentle pressure from a pin. Pyrite and mica shatter or flake apart under that same pressure, so anything that crumbles under a pin was never gold to begin with. Mica is the other common imposter, and it is feather-light, so it swirls and drifts in the pan while gold refuses to move at all. And gold never tarnishes, so a bright, warm speck sitting in filthy black sand after thousands of years is behaving exactly as gold should. One more cheap test is the streak, since dragging a suspect grain across an unglazed white tile leaves a colored line behind. Gold leaves a golden yellow streak on that tile, while pyrite leaves a dark greenish-black mark that ends the argument immediately. Most of the gold in most creeks is flour gold, meaning particles as fine as kitchen flour, and thousands would barely cover a coin. Flour gold is light enough that surface tension can hold it up, so it sometimes floats and washes over the edge of the pan unseen. A single drop of dish soap in the pan breaks that tension and lets the flour gold sink, and that trick costs you almost nothing. Pan slowly over a bucket rather than in open water, since every beginner loses material, and a bucket lets you rerun what escaped. Use a small plastic snuffer bottle to lift the specks out, because fingers and tweezers lose more fine gold than most people admit. Flour gold also travels a long way, so finding it proves gold exists somewhere in that watershed, and honestly, very little else. The next form up the ladder is the flake, which is a thin, flattened piece of metal, often about the size of a grain of rice. Gold is soft, so tumbling downstream literally hammers a piece flatter over time, which makes flatness a rough measure of distance. A thin, beaten flake has come a long way to reach you, while a thicker, chunky piece with rough edges has not traveled nearly as far. Nuggets are simply lumps big enough to pick up with your fingers, and the honest truth is that most of them are far smaller than a pea. A smooth, rounded nugget has been tumbling for a very long time, and every sharp edge it once had was pounded away by rock and water. A rough nugget with jagged edges and deep pits has barely moved at all, which means the vein it came from is probably close by. So two nuggets of identical weight can tell you completely different things, and only one of them is pointing you anywhere useful. Sometimes a rough piece still has white quartz welded into it, and that is the strongest hint you can hold, since it left home recently. The rarest form is crystalline told, where the metal grew slowly enough to form actual crystals and small branching shapes. If you ever find that, please do not melt it, since collectors pay well above melting value for crystalline pieces and for gold in quartz. Put all of this together and you have a method, since you follow the gold upstream and watch the pieces get rougher and heavier as you go. When the gold suddenly stops appearing as you work your way upstream, you have just passed the point where it enters that creek. That is how prospectors trace placer gold back toward its source, and it costs nothing beyond patience and careful attention. Work one drainage at a time and take notes on where each piece came from, since memory alone will blur every creek together. Keep the black sand you concentrate as well, since fine gold hides in it, and a slow second pass at home often finds what you missed. Check the rules before you dig anywhere, since much of the good ground is claimed or private and permission costs nothing to ask for. Fill in your holes and leave the bank the way you found it, since that is what keeps this ground open for whoever comes along next. Most days out end with a few specks that would not cover a fingernail, and that is the honest and normal result of this hobby. Finding a little gold still matters though, since it proves the ground works and it tells you the method you used was sound. The skill builds slowly, and each creek you learn to read makes the next one easier, which is really the whole point of learning it. If you want to keep learning this with me, all it takes is a quick tap on that subscribe button down there on your screen. Leave a like if this helped you out today, and watch the next video that is already waiting there on your screen right now. In it, I go through more practical ground and more of the signs that tell you where the metal is actually sitting out there. Thanks for liking and subscribing. Good luck, Gold Hunter!